In the year 476, the Roman Empire died. Every textbook says so. A Germanic warlord named Odoacer deposed the last emperor in the West, a teenage boy with the almost cruelly ironic name Romulus Augustulus, and that was that. Rome was over. Civilization, according to generations of European historians, went dark, except it didn't. Because roughly 1,400 miles east of Rome, in a city ringed by water on three sides and guarded by walls, no army in the world could break. An empire calling itself Roman kept right on going. It kept going through plagues that killed half its capital. It kept going through a siege where the attacking navy tried to burn the city down and got burned alive instead. It kept going after being betrayed and gutted by its own supposed allies. It kept going after losing its breadbasket, its heartland, and most of its territory, more than once. So here's the question. Nobody really answers properly. How does an empire survive for over 1,000 years after the empire it belonged to has already, officially on paper in every history book, ceased to exist? How do you lose Egypt, Syria, and North Africa in a single generation and not collapse? How do you get sacked by your own allies, fellow Christians no less, and still come back? How do you hold the most contested choke point on earth against Goths, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus Vikings, and Crusaders, sometimes multiple times each, and only actually lose it once at the very end, and only when your enemy invents a weapon nobody in the world had ever seen before? This is the story of the Byzantine Empire. Officially, it lasted from 330 to 1453, 1,123 years. That's longer than the United States has existed, times 3. This is how it managed to survive the impossible, again and again, until the one time it finally couldn't. If this kind of deep historical dive is what you're here for, hit the like button and subscribe, because we are about to go through a millennium of near-death experiences, and every single one of them is real. The story starts with a decision that, at the time, looked almost administrative. In 330 CE, the Roman Emperor Constantine the founded a new capital on the site of an ancient Greek trading colony called Byzantium, at the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. He named it after himself, Constantinople. It wasn't meant to replace Rome, it was meant to be a second capital, a way of managing an empire that had simply become too large, too stretched, too vulnerable at its edges for one city to administer. That decision turned out to be the single most consequential act of urban planning in the history of the Western world. Because when Rome finally buckled under the pressure of Germanic migrations, economic collapse, and administrative rot in the 5th century, the eastern half of the empire, richer, better defended, and anchored by a capital that was almost absurdly hard to attack, simply didn't fall with it. While the West fractured into a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms, the East kept its bureaucracy, kept its tax base, kept its army, and kept calling itself, without a hint of irony, the Roman Empire. The people living inside it never called themselves Byzantines. They called themselves Romaioi, Romans. The word Byzantine is a label historians invented centuries later, largely to make it easier to talk about the Eastern Empire as something distinct from the West. To the people who lived and died inside it, there was no fall of Rome. Rome had simply moved. Why did Constantinople work when Rome didn't? Geography did most of the heavy lifting. The city sat on a peninsula, protected on 3 sides by water, the Sea of Marmara, the Bosphorus, and a natural harbor called the Golden Horn. The only vulnerable approach was a narrow strip of land to the west, and on that one exposed side, the empire built something that would go on to embarrass every army that tried it for the next 1,000 years, the Theodosian Walls. Constructed between 412 and 422 CE, the Theodosian Walls stretched roughly 4 miles, and they weren't just a wall, they were a system, a moat, then a low outer wall, then a terrace, then an inner wall towering up to 40 feet high, studded with nearly 100 defensive towers. To take Constantinople by land, an army had to fight through 3 separate layers of defense in sequence, under constant fire from above with no cover. For over 1,000 years, from the moment those walls were finished until the day gunpowder finally caught up to them, no army broke through the Theodosian Walls by force, not once. Think about that number for a second. 1,000 years. The walls that protected this city outlasted entire other civilizations from founding to collapse. But walls alone don't explain 1,000 years of survival. Something else was happening. And it very nearly didn't survive its own success. Fast forward to the year 532. The emperor is Justinian I, a peasant's nephew who had clawed his way to the throne, and he is about to have the worst week of his reign. A week that nearly ended the empire before it had the chance to become what we now remember it as. Constantinople in the 6th century had a passion for chariot racing that bordered on religious devotion. The Hippodrome, the massive racing stadium at the heart of the city, could hold around 100,000 spectators. and the crowd was organized into fan factions, the most powerful being the Blues and the Greens. These weren't just sports rivalries. They were closer to political parties with their own grievances, their own loyalties, and their own capacity for violence. On January 10th, 532, the city prefect ordered the execution of several rioters from both factions after earlier unrest. The gallows broke. 2 men survived, 1 blue to 1 green, and monks spirited them away to sanctuary. 3 days later, at the next round of races, both factions came to the hippodrome and asked Justinian together for clemency. He said nothing. The silence lit a fuse nobody expected. The Blues and the Greens, sworn enemies for generations, united. They stormed through the city, chanting a single word, Nika, conquer. They burned the offices of the city prefect. They burned the Senate House. They burned a significant portion of the original Hagia Sophia to the ground. For 5 days, Constantinople was on fire, and a rival claimant to the throne was crowned emperor in the very hippodrome where it had all started. Justinian, according to the historian Procopius, was ready to flee the city. His ministers had a ship loaded and waiting, and then his wife, the Empress Theodora, a former actress who had clawed her own way up from nothing, arguably an even harder climb than her husband's, stood up in front of the imperial council and, according to Procopius, said something along these lines. That flight might buy safety, but for someone who has worn the purple, being a fugitive is unbearable. That royalty makes a fine burial shroud. Justinian stayed. His generals, Belisarius and Mundus, quietly moved loyal troops into position, entered the hippodrome through separate gates while it was packed with rioters, and sealed every exit. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. Estimates placed the death toll at around 30,000 people, cut down inside the very stadium where the uprising had begun. It's a brutal, uncomfortable story. But it's also the hinge on which the entire Byzantine Golden Age turns, because Justinian didn't just survive the Nika riots. He used the ashes of the old Hagia Sophia to build something almost unimaginably more ambitious. The new Hagia Sophia, completed in 537, stood as the largest cathedral on earth for nearly 1,000 years, with a dome so vast and seemingly weightless that legend claimed it must be suspended from heaven by a golden chain. Justinian also commissioned the Codex Justinianus, a systematic overhaul of Roman law so thorough and so well organized that it became the foundation of legal systems across continental Europe for the next 13 centuries, and he sent his general Belisarius west, reconquering north, Africa from the Vandals, and for a brief and expensive moment, retaking Italy and Rome itself. The empire that had almost burned to the ground in a chariot racing riot was, within a few short years, ruling more territory around the Mediterranean than it had in over a century. Then the plague arrived. Beginning in 541, what modern researchers now believe was an early strain of the same bacterium behind the Black Death tore through Constantinople and the wider Mediterranean world. Contemporary estimates, and yes, ancient population figures always come with a wide margin of error, suggest that somewhere between 40 and 60% of the capital's population died. The empire, that had just reconquered half the western Mediterranean, now didn't have the manpower or the money to actually hold on to it. 2 extinction-level crises, one from a chariot race, one from a flea. Both survived. If you're starting to sense a pattern here, you're paying attention because the pattern repeats for the next 800 years. By the 670s, a new and far more dangerous threat had appeared at the walls. Arab armies, riding the explosive momentum of early Islamic expansion, had already stripped the empire of Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, its wealthiest, most productive provinces, in a matter of decades. Now they wanted Constantinople itself. If the city fell, there was a real possibility that Islamic expansion into Europe could have arrived centuries earlier and gone much, much further than it eventually did. The Arab fleet arrived and began a siege that would grind on in phases from 674 to 678. And this is where the empire unveiled something that had never existed before in the ancient or medieval world: Greek fire. Nobody today knows the exact recipe. It was one of the most tightly guarded state secrets in Byzantine history, reportedly known only to a single family of engineers, passed down and never fully written out. What we do know is what it did. Pumped through bronze tubes mounted on the prows of Byzantine ships, it sprayed a stream of burning liquid that clung to wood, to sails, to skin, and this is the part that terrified every sailor who ever faced it. It kept burning even on the surface of the water. Imagine being on a wooden ship, surrounded by the sea, and realizing the sea itself is now on fire. The Arab fleet was devastated. The siege broke. They came back again in 717 to 718, better prepared, expecting a different outcome. Greek fire met them again. That siege broke too. Historians studying the geography of this period have made a sobering observation. Had those walls and that weapon failed, the entire trajectory of European history changes. The Theodosian Walls and Greek Fire working together may have been the single most important reason Western Europe developed the way it did, rather than becoming, centuries earlier, an extension of the Islamic world. That's not a small claim. That's the empire, quite literally, buying time for an entire continent without that continent ever fully realizing it. If you're starting to see why this empire refuses to fit into the Rome fell in 476 story you were taught in school, subscribe now, because we're only about a third of the way through 1,000 years of this, and it gets more dramatic from here, not less. By the turn of the 11th century, under an emperor named Basil II, the empire reached a level of raw military dominance it hadn't seen in centuries. Basil earned a nickname that tells you everything about his methods, the Bulgar Slayer. In 1014, after decades of grinding war against the Bulgarian Empire, Basil's forces won a decisive victory at the Battle of Cladion. What he did next has become one of the most infamous acts in medieval warfare. According to the accounts that have survived, Basil ordered roughly 14,000 to 15,000 captured Bulgarian soldiers blinded, with one man left with a single working eye for every 100 prisoners, so that he could lead his blinded comrades home. When the Bulgarian Tsar reportedly saw the returning column, he collapsed and died of shock within days. It's horrifying. It's also, in the coldest possible strategic terms, effective. Bulgaria was fully absorbed into the empire not long after. Under Basil II, the Byzantine Empire controlled more territory than it had in 400 years, stretching from southern Italy to the Caucasus, from the Danube to the edges of Syria. And then, within a single lifetime of Basil's death, it started to unravel. In 1071, at a place called Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, a Byzantine army was catastrophically defeated by the Seljuk Turks. On its own, one lost battle shouldn't sink an empire that had survived plagues, sieges, and riots. But Manzikert triggered a civil war over the succession, and while the empire tore itself apart internally fighting over who should be emperor, the Seljuks poured into Anatolia, the empire's agricultural and demographic heartland, the region that had fed its armies and filled its tax rolls for 700 years, and simply kept it. Anatolia would never again be fully Byzantine. That was the first crack. The second one came from somewhere nobody in Constantinople saw coming, because it came from people who were supposed to be on the same side. In 1204, a Crusader army, Western European Christians, ostensibly marching toward Jerusalem to fight Muslim forces in the Holy Land, arrived outside Constantinople. Through a chain of financial debts, dynastic disputes, and Venetian commercial interests, the Fourth Crusade never made it anywhere near Jerusalem. Instead, it turned its full force against the greatest Christian city on earth. The walls that had held for nearly 800 years against Goths, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Rus finally fell. Not to a Muslim army, not to an army that had come specifically to conquer the city, but to a Crusader force that had set out, at least in name, to defend Christendom. The city was sacked with a brutality that shocked even contemporaries hardened to medieval warfare. Churches were stripped of relics and gold. The bronze horses that once stood in the Hippodrome were carted off to Venice, where they still stand today above the doors of St. Mark's Basilica. The empire was carved up into competing Crusader statelets, and what remained of Byzantine rule fled into exile, ruling from provincial cities while foreign lords sat on the throne of Constantinople. Here is the part that should genuinely astonish you. The empire came back. In 1261, Byzantine forces recaptured Constantinople and restored the empire on its own throne. Think about the sheer stubbornness that requires losing your own capital city to your supposed allies, watching it get looted and divided up, and still, within a couple of generations, taking it back and calling yourselves Romans again as if nothing had happened. But the empire that returned in 1261 was a shadow of what had marched with Basil II. It never fully recovered its territory, its wealth, or its army. For the next 2 centuries, the Byzantine Empire shrank piece by piece until it was barely more than the city of Constantinople itself and a scattering of nearby territories. An empire in name, a city-state in reality, surviving on diplomacy, marriage alliances, and the simple, brutal fact that its walls were still, after nearly 1,000 years, the best defensive fortification on the planet. By 1451, a new Ottoman Sultan came to power, Mehmed II, 21 years old and utterly consumed by one goal: taking the city that his ancestors had failed to take for over a century. In 1451, an engineer named Orban, some accounts say Hungarian, some say from further afield, arrived in Constantinople with a proposal. He could build the emperor a cannon powerful enough to breach any wall in the world. Constantine VI, the last Byzantine emperor, wanted to hire him. The treasury, drained by 2 centuries of decline, couldn't meet Orban's price. Orban walked to the Ottoman court instead. Mehmed's resources were, for practical purposes, unlimited. What Orban built for him was a bronze bombard nearly 27 feet long, capable of firing stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds over a mile. It took dozens of oxen and hundreds of men just to move it into position. It took hours to reload after every single shot, but when it fired, no wall built by human hands had ever been designed to survive it. The siege began in early April 1453. Inside the city, somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 defenders, roughly half of them foreign volunteers from Genoa and Venice, holding roughly 4 miles of wall against a force numbering, by most estimates, well over 80,000. Constantine V closed the gates, repaired the Theodosian Walls as best his meager treasury allowed, and stretched a massive iron chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn to keep the Ottoman navy out of the city's most vulnerable harbor. For weeks, Orban's cannon and dozens of smaller guns pounded the ancient walls. And here's a detail that captures the empire's entire character in miniature. Even against gunpowder, even in its final days, the defenders kept repairing the breaches overnight, filling the gaps with earth, timber, and rubble faster than the Ottomans could widen them. Then Mehmed did something nobody inside the city thought was physically possible. Unable to force the great chain blocking the Golden Horn, he ordered around 70 ships hauled bodily out of the water, greased on wooden rails, and dragged overland across the hills north of the city under cover of night, then relaunched behind the chain directly into the harbor the defenders had believed was secure. The city that had never been surrounded on every side in over 1,000 years woke up on April 22nd to discover an enemy fleet floating in the one harbor that was supposed to be safe. Food ran low. A lunar eclipse in the final weeks was read by the terrified population as a divine omen of the end. And still, the defenders held. The final assault came in the darkest hours before dawn on May 29th, 1453. Mehmed sent his least valuable troops first. Irregulars meant to exhaust the defenders and die in the process. Then, regular Anatolian infantry. Then, just before sunrise, his elite janissaries, the most disciplined soldiers in his entire army, surged through breaches that 53 days of continuous bombardment had finally, permanently opened. Somewhere along the walls, a small postern gate called the Kirkeporta was found, unlocked or improperly secured. Ottoman troops poured through it into the city's flank, and the defense that had held for nearly 2 months began to collapse all at once. Constantine V, the last Roman emperor, tore off his imperial regalia so he could not be identified and captured for ransom or humiliation, and threw himself into the fighting at the walls alongside his remaining soldiers. His body was never conclusively identified afterward. The Roman Empire, the actual continuous, unbroken institution founded by Augustus 14.5 centuries earlier, ended not with a treaty, not with a slow fade into administrative irrelevance, but with an emperor disappearing into hand-to-hand combat at the gates of his own capital. So think back to where we started. Rome fell in 476, according to every textbook. But the empire that called itself Rome kept living, kept fighting, kept building, kept burning, kept coming back from catastrophes that should have ended it for nearly 1,000 more years after that supposed death. It survived a riot that killed 30,000 of its own citizens in a single week. It survived a plague that may have killed more than half its capital. It survived 2 Arab sieges that could have redrawn the map of Europe entirely, using a weapon so effective its exact formula died, with the empire itself. It survived losing its own heartland at Manzikert. It survived the almost unthinkable betrayal of being sacked by fellow Christians in 1204, and then it clawed its own capital back 57 years later. It survived as little more than a single fortified city for its final 2 centuries, propped up by walls that had already outlasted every civilization that had ever tried to break them. And in the end, it wasn't corruption that finally killed it. It wasn't internal rot, or a slow fade, or a single catastrophic mistake. It took a 21-year-old sultan, an engineer the empire itself couldn't afford to hire, and a cannon representing an entirely new category of weapon that simply hadn't existed for the previous 10 centuries of sieges. Here's the real question this story leaves you with. How many empires in human history can say they were only ever defeated once? Genuinely, permanently defeated? And it took the literal invention of a new form of warfare to finally do it. How many institutions of any kind survive 1,000 years of plague, riot, betrayal, and siege, and only fall when the rules of the game themselves change underneath them? The Byzantine Empire didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because, for one single week in the spring of 1453, the impossible finally stopped being survivable. If this gave you a version of history you didn't already know, subscribe and let me know in the comments. Which moment in this story surprised you the most? The Nika riots, Greek fire, the ships dragged overland? I read every one of them.